The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Cindy Bunch is Associate Publisher and Director of Editorial at InterVarsity Press. She's also trained as a spiritual director. Cindy and I got together to talk about her work as an editor, as well as her new book, Be Kind to Yourself. Cindy Bunch, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast. I appreciate you making time for me.
Thank you for having me.
So your book is called Be Kind to Yourself.
That's right.
And it's about, I guess, being kind to yourself, about making getting out of those patterns of self-talk and all the ways that we say things, mean things to ourselves we wouldn't ever say to anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Especially trying to work with that voice of the inner critic is one of the themes that I think is relevant to writers, which is the inner critic is that voice that that makes you feel small and tells you you're bad or wrong or useless. It's a voice of shame. So that's kind of one of the themes.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I try to, or I do tell writers is, we're talking about making friends with the inner critic. Mm-hmm. Not silencing the inner critic. Mm-hmm. There certainly are things you need to silence, but a person who doesn't have an inner critic, our word for that is lunatic. And so, how do you? I think it's. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this. Again, with respect to writing, I think it has a lot to do with saying to the inner critic, "Hey, could you just sort of go do something else for a little while I work on this first draft?" Yeah. And then I welcome you, inner critic. I want you to come back, but just not right now. That's great.
I once heard a speaker at a writers' conference that said, historically there've been some writers who've tried to deal with the inner critic by getting the inner critic drunk, but he said he did not actually recommend that. It doesn't really work out. But it is that problem of how do you shut down that voice. Instead, one of the stories I tell in my book, actually my editor, Al Shee, told me that his wife deals a lot with the inner critic. And so he actually speaks to her inner critic, like she'll talk to him about, what she's like, this message is running through her mind that's really negative, and he'll call out that inner critic and say, "You're being a bully," knock it off.
Yeah.
So that's, having a friend help and support you in that is one way.
Yeah, right. That's great. Do you, I'd love to hear about how you, in the middle of writing this particular book, about, self-talk, about the inner critic, how did the inner critic treat you during this process?
Yeah, well, we have a lot of ways to experience reviews now and comments, even more so, I would say, than ever, with places like Goodreads and Amazon, and where you can see people's thoughts about your work. And I've spent a lot of years helping authors process that, but I have already gotten to process a little bit myself what it's like to have people kind of not get your work, not understand it. And sometimes I think that's because some of these reviewers are not the right reader for the book. But other times it's because, that the reviewer might have a real piece of input that you can take to heart and use in the future. So it's discerning between those two things and going on and continuing to do the work is the difficulty for writers. And so I have written out for myself, actually just recently, a little prayer for self-kindness after reading a bad review. Can I read that to you?
I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
Lord, my feelings are hurt by these words. The reviewer doesn't seem to understand my work. I want to argue, protest, clarify, but it's not a dialogue. My inner critic is saying, "I told you so." Voices from my past are joining in. Is there anything here that I need to take to heart? Give me the wisdom to accept it with grace. Which are the things I need to let go? Give me the discernment to know the difference. Guide me to the words of truth about my work. Make the voices of affirmation ring in my ears. Remind me of my calling and gifting. Grow a spirit of confidence in me. Give me the strength to continue to create. I offer my work to you. So one of the things I wanted to remind myself and others in the prayer is that we remember the negative words that people speak so clearly, and we forget the affirmations. And so I think, my encouragement to artists would be, keep those affirmations somewhere close, memorize them, or, put them on a card or something else. Keep them close at hand. Yeah. And then I think the other thing I would say to writers about all this, about, when they feel discouraged, 31 years I've been editing books, and I am privileged to see so many comments from readers that come in about the books we publish. And you just never know. You never know who is going to be touched or helped or served or drawn to Jesus by your words. And that's a calling, and that is part of the work that we are called to do.
Yeah. That's so good. And there, Flannery O'Connor said, I'm paraphrasing, but she said, when I put the work out there, some people may be, it may be a stumbling block to some people. Some people might be drawn to Christ. I don't know what's going to happen. It's not my business. It's God's business.
Yeah, that's right.
And
that's right.
My job is to do the work.
Yes.
And
yes.
And there are so many things that keep us from doing those. I mean, it's so easy to sort of fall into this whirlhole of self everything, right? Self criticism, self aggrandizement. So, I mean, just thinking about self, and writing is just not a good. We want writing. Somehow we get in our heads that writing is going to do things for us to sort of to neutralize self-loathing or to make me loved, or there are all these things that we expect writing to do that that little donkey can't carry that much of a burden. And so I think it's so important for writers to sort of get out of that self whirlhole and think about loving the reader and reaching out beyond the self. because it's that self-centeredness, I think, that is the such an enemy of writing.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, I mean, it's interesting because I think that's a lot of the role of the editor as well, is to sort of step in. My former colleague, now retired, Jim Hoover, Jim was the editor for Long Obedience in the Same Direction and a number of other Eugene Peterson books, and he taught me a lot. And he would talk about the editor is a bridge between the reader and the author.
Huh.
And so, and that I really see that role. So I step in and sort of help the author speak to the reader effectively. And I think that's a big part of the input that we're trying to give to authors. And I hope it helps the authors to see the editor as kind if they think about it in that kind of way.
Yeah. So what did you learn about your role as an editor from being a writer being edited?
Yeah, well, it was so my colleague Al Shee was my editor, and I had edited his book Grieving Suicide, and another book on the suburbs before that. So it was a turnabout, both as colleagues and then of him editing me, and I saw how excellent he is. And a couple of things about our process. One is that we give a developmental report, and then the author revises before we start doing any copy editing or line editing. And so that I saw the value of that process. I had an author once say to me in reference to those reports that the editors write about 9 times out of 11. And when she said that, I thought, oh, okay, those are decent odds. I'll take those odds. And so I found that to be, fairly true. And that most of the things, again, how I think about it is I don't always have the solution that's going to sort of resolve the issue that's coming up, but I can point to the issues. But often the author has a better solution or a different solution. Yeah. So it might suggest several things and invite the author to find the way through the question. So I found that to be true. And then the other thing is that time away and then coming back really helps. And so we always encourage authors to do that during the developmental reading process. Normally authors get 6 or 8 weeks away, and then you come back fresh, and that really helps.
Yeah. And so your authors, they are sufficiently timely to allow for that 6 to 8 week break?
Yeah, well, a book takes a long time to get done, and I think it's very well worth it. I certainly found it for myself. Every time I would go away and then come back, I would just see things. Of course, the danger is that you could do that forever. You have to stop it at some point.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's really hard to get distance from your own writing, and
yes.
The easiest way is just to put it away and come back later. Although I know I found myself in situations more than once where I was so late on delivering the manuscript, that I didn't, I didn't have 6 or 8 weeks to.
Sure, we do, and we have those instances too where you have to rush it along. And there's some things, some art serves itself better for that than other art.
Right. That's right. So here, I do have this question about, to return to the idea of being kind to yourself. Being kind to yourself probably isn't the same thing as going too easy or soft on yourself. How do you sort of keep your own feet to the fire, and hold yourself accountable when you are being kind to yourself? I'm drawing. I know I'm making a false distinction. I mean, a false whatever the word is. Because I know you're not saying being kind to yourself doesn't mean just being self-indulgent.
Right. Yeah. So the book's not about having spa days or things like that. So I noticed the song that Andrew Peterson had written called "Be Kind to Yourself" as I was after I was actually kind of fairly deep in this process, and it's a delightful song. And he asks a question in the song like this. He says, "How does it end when the war that you're in is just you against you?" And I take that as an echo of Romans 7. I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. So there is sin. And I think for Christians it's important to stop and say, okay, there's sin that we have to acknowledge and confess. But then it's that confessing and moving on in the light of grace that some of us need to be reminded of. So when I become aware of sin, I can make a choice to address it with self-kindness. David Benner writes in The Gift of Being Yourself, self-transformation is always preceded by self-acceptance. And that was a really important quote for me as I was writing the book, kind of a key idea. So self-transformation is always preceded by self-acceptance. So rather than comparing myself to others who seem to do better than I do, I can say kind things to myself like, thank you, God, for allowing me to see this. Forgive me. Help me to grow more in this area. And then when I'm kind, I'm actually more likely to let it go and move on into maturity instead of kind of just getting stuck in that negative loop and being a sinful person who's angry with herself. That doesn't really help anybody.
Yeah. And reminded of the verse that it is the kindness of God that draws us to repentance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I love this idea of breaking out of loops, right? I mean, I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about what you're talking about, and repentance as a way of saying, I'm in this loop, and now I'm going to break the loop, and I'm just going to move. I mean, a loop, by definition, I mean, you can't change directions if you're in a loop. You're just kind of or all you're doing is change directions or something. But you can't, until you stop looping and start moving towards something again that's outside yourself, something that you didn't invent, that wasn't in your, that wasn't coming from your brain, but rather is something outside yourself.
Yeah.
Really, really helpful. I love it. Now, but I do want to ask this other question though, because self-flagellation and fear as a motivator actually can work, right? I mean, I wrote more than one book just straight out of fear. Waking up in the morning and saying, getting up in the morning and writing because I couldn't sleep because I was so afraid of, having to give the advance back or, and so I have definitely dealt with that, have found it motivating until one day it just wasn't anymore, right? Until one day, no amount of self-flagellation could get me to do the work. I was like, I would just rather, that I guess I used to think in terms of I would write when the pain of not writing got greater than the pain of writing. Because writing's painful, for me anyway, for a lot of people. And I went for years that was kind of the way I thought about it. The pain of there's some pain in not writing and there's some pain in writing, and which one's greater today? And I'll avoid whichever one is greater today. And man, that is just it's not sustainable. Although it carried me along or I carried it or whatever for a long time. So I don't know. I mean, you have thoughts on this idea of self-flagellation as a motivator? Is it something that, I mean, maybe you're so emotionally healthy that's not something you've ever experienced. I don't know.
Well, I appreciate that story. It's very powerful. And interesting that you ran out of steam eventually with that. It only takes you so far. It's kind of what I'm hearing. I'm more of an editor than I am a writer. That's my main focus. And as an editor, I find that people write best when they write what they want to write, which is also, I think, part of the narrative that you just offered is, when it builds up so much that you just have to write, that you're writing out of the desire. The tricky part is what you just described is for the people who are making their living from writing, right? That is a very different position than I find myself, or than really a lot of our writers are people in ministry, or they have other things that are bringing in income. So I'm sure that it's tricky, and even the thing of writing when you want what you want to write, it can't always be true if you have to take assignments, perhaps. But as far as possible, I encourage writers to follow their calling, follow the stirring, follow the muse. And that's what's going to succeed. One thing that I find odd, actually, as an editor, is when I go to writers' conferences and writers say to me, "What book topics are you looking for?" Yeah. And I think writing a book is an enormous undertaking. It's not assignment writing in my mind. It needs to be the thing that only you can write, and the thing that flows naturally out of everything you're doing. Again, thinking largely about people that are in various other kinds of ministry as well. It's the thing that flows out of the whole of your life and work is the thing that you should write, because you're going to have to keep talking about it for a long time, especially if you're writing nonfiction. You're gonna be doing conferences and speaking and teaching and writing more about it, and so it needs to be really interesting to you.
I always say, what do you have to give to the writer that the writer can't get for himself? And that very question of what are you looking for, that's a person who's not asking that question. What do I have to give? You're thinking in terms of what, when you're asking that question, you're saying, what can you give me? Right? Give me a topic that's going to benefit me, rather than here's something that I can give.
Yeah, that's right. So it can work for certain journalism or certain areas, perhaps, to just like putting words on a page and playing with that. But it doesn't work very well for a nonfiction book.
Yeah, I've done a lot of actually copywriting, for advertising, and I say advertising, some advertising, just various marketing type things, just to keep food on the table, and then I now don't remember why I brought that up, except that we were talking about assignments.
Yeah.
It does de-glamorize writing a little bit, I can tell you. That to have that many deadlines in one day, and to have to speak in that many different voices in one day, it was good training. But it also helps you long for. One of the things that it has done for me is make me long for the kind of writing that you're talking about, that grows out of. The truth is, I don't have that many strong feelings about which bank somebody should bank at. I've written brochures for banks, and that has that work has built some important skills for me as a writer. Not the least of which is some disciplines, of hitting deadlines, multiple deadlines, and but then also reinvigorating me to do work that does feel like it's coming from inside instead of from outside.
Yeah, you probably can't be in that mode of writing the profound stories of your life, or I don't know. I suppose we're not always in the mode of our highest creativity. But that kind of disciplined writing, I've done a lot of back cover copywriting in my years, and that's sort of like assignment writing, but it's good. It helps you hone the craft.
Yeah. I want to talk to you for a minute about you have an adjusted version of Saint Ignatius's exam, and I don't know if I'm saying that word, but how do you pronounce that?
Examen.
Yeah, and so I guess his idea is at the end of the day, review your day and think, where are the places where I was closer to God, and that's the consolation, and where was I more distant from? Am I saying? And that's
right.
Where was I more distant from God, and that was a desolation.
Yep.
Is that close and distant? That's the right category?
That's how I understand it.
That wasn't working because it was generating shame.
That's right. So it started with reading a manuscript by a couple of my authors, Jim and Alan Fadling, and they were writing a book called "What Does Your Soul Love?" And it was this sentence where they were describing how we open ourselves to God, and they write, "Notice where you're bugged." And I was editing, I was writing a developmental report, but that just stopped me short, and I felt caught by God in that moment. And I thought, okay, there's something here for me that's beyond the work. And so I made a note of that and then started working with it later. And I decided to take that phrase and use it as a part of a personal examen. And so I would ask myself each day 2 questions. What's bugging you? And then the second question, what's bringing you joy? And that was my way of translating the desolation, what's bugging me, what's making me far from God, and what's bringing me joy, what's drawing me near to God. The examen, as I had been taught it by Ignatius, was typically practiced at night. So you review your day. And it tended to draw me into like all the things that went wrong, all the things that I did wrong, and that doesn't make me sleepy. So one twist for me was putting that in the morning. So every morning in my journal, I think back through the past day and then I write down those notes, and it kind of clears my head for the day to come. And it helps me to start to recognize, what are the things that are hooking me, that I'm going to need to let go. And then the what's bringing me joy, of course, it's a gratitude practice. But it's also, again, this thing of God drawing near. Birds have been really important to me in this, particularly during recent months, and just noticing birds and seeing those as a gift from God, as God's creation. So just these kinds of little things that remind me that God is near, that the Creator has made a beautiful creation, kindnesses, from people, things that bring you hope and joy. And so those are the things that just cause me to notice God and notice that God is near.
So your 2 questions, what's bugging me and what brings me joy, you're saying this is you're still doing Saint Ignatius' examen, just it's not that you come up with 2 new questions, it's that you have questions that are just another way of getting at the exact same thing that Saint Ignatius.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We don't have time to talk about how important gratitude is for the writing process, but it is so important to being awake to what's going on in the world around you. It's great. So you are. We haven't even talked about this yet. You're trained as a spiritual director. And what's the overlap you see between being, or do you see any overlap? I guess I should say that, between being a spiritual director and being an editor.
Yeah. So I decided to do spiritual direction training because I thought it would help my editing. It helps a bit in the content area because I work on spiritual formation in particular, but also because I do see this tie between spiritual direction and editing. And for me, it's first of all those moments where I meet with an author or talk with an author and trying to draw out of them, what do they want to do? What is this book about? What's the structure? What's the calling of this book? And then also, as I read, again, trying to connect with what does the reader need? And in a way, maybe that could also be thought of as is what am I seeing emerging in the book itself, which can be the Holy Spirit. I think, there's this thought of the muse, but I think for Christians, it's the Spirit is guiding and can surprise you with what comes out if we work in collaboration with the Spirit. And so I think I'm like a spiritual director. I'm trying to listen to the Spirit and listen to the author, as you might listen to a directee and listen to the Holy Spirit when you're doing spiritual direction. Now, the part that I don't always love is there's a third piece, which is the market. The sort of more pleasant way to frame it is to think about the reader, the audience, and we do want to serve those, but there's also some realities of what we think will or won't work for the publishing house that comes into it. So it's not as sort of pure as spiritual direction, but I do like bringing those things that I've learned into it.
Yeah. And to what extent is your work with writers? How to ask this question? I mean, there's so many. I always say writing is not. Writing issues are never just writing issues. Right? There's always this swirl going around. I mean, sometimes if we're talking about passive voice, sometimes it's just a writing issue. But there's so many other things swirling around the writer, that are keeping them from getting the work done. And I mean, to what extent is your work as an editor, I don't know, counseling or I mean, it's obviously it's way beyond. It seems to me that you're a conscientious editor. That work ends up going beyond just, as you said, figuring out, matching up the manuscript with the market and the reader and all that kind of stuff. There's some spiritual work going on there.
That's right. It surprised me. That was one of the first things that surprised me. I thought being an editor was just sitting around reading manuscripts all day, and it's so much more people time than I ever would have imagined. And encouraging, helping people through the hard places, through the doubts, through the writing can plunge you into things that you didn't know, places you didn't know you were going, particularly if you're using personal narrative, as part of it. I definitely have seen spiritual warfare around writing, particularly in areas of race, of justice, we've done some books with International Justice Ministries, IJM, and around slavery that continues worldwide. I think there's real warfare. So I've seen that kind of thing happen as well. But it's a joy. I love that part of the work, that I get to be with people through this journey. And it's so satisfying. I don't know, there's not a lot of jobs where you go from this little root idea that people have all the way through this process to the end, and you get this product, this beautiful book. And on a regular basis, that happens. and I just think that's a real grace of the job, to have these shelves lined with the things that you did and worked on and collaborated with. So
I can imagine. I've always thought it'd be a really great job, great work to be an editor. So and I so appreciate the work that people like you do. I mean, they're for my own work, yes, but more to the point, for all these. I mean, my rooms are full of books that people like you help bring to the world. So thank you.
Yes, well, thank you. It's really a joy and a privilege. So I've been on the show twice before, or you didn't know it, but both Tish Warren and Jen Michelle quoted things that their editor said, which was
I didn't know we were talking about you.
Yep. So but I like that I like that background space.
Yeah, good. Okay, I'm going to ask you the question I always end these discussions with, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
Yes. So I love that question. That's a great question. So Kathleen Norris is a great touch point for me. I've read Cloister Rock many times. I don't always read books over, but I've read that one. And that actually drew me to liturgy and well. My authors, of course, IVP authors are wonderful. I asked Ruth Barton to write the foreword because I love her writing. And what I'm looking for in formational writing is writing that draws me into God's presence, that makes me want to go and sit and be with God or to try out a spiritual practice. And I think that Ruth does that. While I was reading the book, while I was writing the book, I was reading 2 books by Mason Curry about artists and writing, and those they're called Daily Rituals: How Artists Work, and Daily Rituals: Women at Work, and they're just like these little snippets of painters and writers and musicians doing their art. And so they're fun to read in tidbits. And similarly, a touch point author for me is Madeline L'Engle. Wrinkle in Time was really important to me as a kid. And she has a book, Madeline L'Engle herself, Reflections on Writing Life. And it's like these nuggets of wisdom, and it's really fun to read while writing. And then my last, I think it's great. So I'm mostly a nonfiction editor, reader, but fiction is great for nonfiction writers as well. And I've been loving Louise Penny's Inspector Ganache series. I'm late to the game, just finding them.
Well, I'm later than you are because I'm
Yeah. Louise Penny. And the audio books are great. I've been listening to the audio books, and they're murder mysteries set in a cute town in Quebec, but really full of spiritual formation, I believe, full of wise thinking about art and life and people. So
well, great. Well, Cindy, this has been a delight. Thank you for being here on The Habit, and I look forward to seeing what other books you help bring into the world.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio in the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to Jess Ray for letting us use her song Too Good as part of this podcast. Visit jessraymusic.com to hear more of her beautiful songs.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.